Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the EMD Campus Ministry Podcast. As we continue on in the Apostles' Creed, now we are on the last two lines of the second major portion of the Apostles' Creed, which is that after he was crucified, dead, and buried, he descended to the dead. Jesus Christ rose again from the dead. And these are the two lines we're going over, he ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From there, he will come to judge the quick and the dead, or the living and the dead, whichever version you prefer. I like quick. Jordan likes quick. We can do that. But let's talk about the first part of that first. He ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. Um, so, breaking it down, talking about Christ ascending into heaven. Obviously, this is post resurrection. It's not like he goes from, the realm of the dead where he was and goes straight to heaven from there. There is some time he spends with his disciples and with other people after, he's resurrected, which I don't know. I think that itself might get overlooked a little bit, right? Because we kind of assume, right, when people die, they go to wherever they're going to go. But that didn't happen with Jesus. He descended to the dead, then he came back, spent some time here, then he ascended. And there's some things you want to talk about here. First off is this idea of Christ actually ascending, because we have this scene in the beginning of the book of Acts where the disciples and other followers are standing around. They're looking at Jesus. He says a few final words, and then he literally moves upwards, um, which is interesting. But I'll hand it off to Jordan to go from there with, what do we do with that Jesus like literally moved up into the sky.
Yeah, and this is the biblical text that we want to reference. Then we'll talk about how it pertains to the creed. Um, I want to point out one thing first and foremost, and I think it'll help us, that nothing about this passage in particular is allegorical, and I think that needs to be said. Like this
Yeah.
is a literal this part of the gospel especially, and really generally the gospels in general are they're trying to tell it as a historical fact, or at least like explain to you what was going on. They each have different takes that they want to get at, or like points they want to make about Jesus' life and what he was getting at. All of them are generally pretty consistent, but for this one they're pretty much unanimous across the board. He ascended, right? He moved upwards, and when they see that, that means literally. So two things I want to point out. The first thing is this: that Jesus goes to a place, to heaven, and he's there, and he's been there. Now, there have been theologians I've been recently made aware that apparently take that upwards very literally and think that he like traveled through space. This is not Jesus, says Neil Armstrong. I'm just going to say that outright. Like, we don't have spaceman Jesus. Please don't do that. That's not what we're trying to get at here. What we're trying to say is that he ascends, he goes upwards, literally upwards into a different place.
Mhm.
Um, that would make sense contextually with how I would say not only the Jewish religion, but with just the way that the Hellenistic world in general would understand and where they would understand heaven to be located, right?
Mhm.
Like the idea of a heaven. Obviously, with our more modern understanding, we understand it's not literally only upward, right? It's some kind of different plane of existence. We have to affirm that, or at least assume that in some ways. But
Yeah.
that's what it's trying to get at, is he literally goes upward. The second thing I want to point out is that when he goes upward and he ascends into heaven, into this different state or this different place, is it never implies in the text or even in the creeds that he changed form in any way. He's already changed form, right, upon his resurrection. And if you haven't heard that podcast, go back and listen to that one because that'll explain this quite a bit.
Yeah.
Um, but he's got this renewed body. So he's not some disembodied spirit going into like heaven land. That's not what's happening here. He is going to this separate place and he's
Mhm.
physically going there. So this is a really hard thought to wrap your head around, but this is really truly what the text is saying. And I feel very comfortable saying this. Jesus, as a physical person, as a
Mhm.
resurrected physical person, is in heaven right now, sitting at the right hand of God Father Almighty. Right? He is physically there, and he will come back. Now we're going to talk about that in the second part of this podcast, but he's going to come back. But he is a physical being, right? At no point has he not been physical. So
Mhm.
this is really important for a couple of reasons. One, I've beat this point to death at this point. If you listen to any of the previous podcasts, just roll your eyes. If you haven't, go back and listen to them so you can roll your eyes. But
Yeah.
it's simply this, that the Gnostics wanted you to think he was a disembodied spirit going on. They wanted you to think that. That was important to their theology and the way they did Revelation. It was important to their worldview, but we need to be careful not to think that way for multiple reasons. One, it's technically heretical, and that's exactly why the creeds were written. So it'd be kind of silly to ignore advice from 2,000 years of like, hey, this isn't true, when they corrected it, what? How many, when did the creeds come about, Ben? We did it on the first podcast. I can't even remember.
Yeah, the first one I think came about in the mid to late 300s, I believe. So somewhere in
So
the
we're
fourth
looking at like
century.
1,700 years of corrected heresy
Yeah.
that we want to make sure we acknowledge. Spoilers, sorry. Like if you haven't seen it by now, a little late to the show. So that's the first thing, though. But in all seriousness, though, that they really want to correct that and they really want to combat that. And two, in our own day, we're probably going to spend a pretty decent amount of time in this podcast and even just in general in the creed, we've already done it, really combating the idea of I'll say the term, I'll just say it outright, dispensational, disembodied spiritual return of Christ, right?
Mhm.
Because this is going to set up the later line in this creed, understanding that because he's a physical being, he's going to have to return as a physical being. Like, it would make no sense to be like, I'm going to go up as a physical being, shed my body, and come back as a spirit. Like, why would you do that? And
Yeah.
secondly, we're going to talk about in the latter part of this podcast that he's going to return, which will also combat some ideas they're going to get at. But the physical
Mhm.
being portion is important because we really want to stress what the afterlife is looking like and the importance of this creation that God's given us. That was like one of our first episodes. It's a big deal. So I'm going to
Yeah.
stop beating a dead horse because I know that right now you've all rolled your eyes and you probably are dizzy from rolling them for so long. So appreciate you listening to my small mini rant. But I wanted to make sure I made that clear of what we're talking about in this portion of post-resurrection like history, but also
Mhm.
in the creed line now.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Like we could spend a lot of time talking about the value of the fact that Jesus was resurrected and it was a physical existence. But you're right. We've touched on that point several times throughout this podcast. It almost seems like a common thread that's run through a lot of this. And we're not even done with it because later on in the creed, we get to the resurrection of the body. It was so we'll, we'll hit it
Then
pretty
we
hard
should
there too.
theoretically be done. Maybe.
Yes.
If it doesn't come up
Then
again in the Holy Spirit, we'll see. So hold your breath.
actually, no, the last line, the life everlasting. We'll probably hit
Yep.
it again.
Yeah, don't
Uh,
hold your breath. Don't mind. Don't do it.
yeah, but I mean, it is important. I mean, especially nowadays, it's so surprising that we live in a society that is as much as our culture talks about the value of science and material reductionism, it's also incredibly gnostic when it comes to a lot of different things, but especially spiritual things. It's very gnostic, tends to be very gnostic. So, even it, and that's nothing new. Like we've already talked about, like these creeds that really emphasize that, or emphasize, working against Gnosticism. It's not new. So there is that. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. So it does beg the question, though, when Jesus ascended into heaven, uh, it kind of asks the question, did he leave us on our own at that point? Like, did he leave? He was like, yeah, you guys, good luck for the next 2,000 years or more. Um, I'll see you on the other side. Which
That's a
is
great question.
sometimes how it's interpreted, right? Like Jesus left the disciples with his teachings. Eventually, the scriptures came about, and that's what we have. But Jesus just sort of left and was like, peace out. I'll see you guys later. But is that really what happened? Well, no. I mean, we do know that he did leave us with his teachings. He imparted his teachings to the disciples, who then passed them on to their followers. Christ was with the disciples for 40 days after he was resurrected. So there was a lot of conversation certainly that happened there.
That's
Um,
over a month.
yeah, it's over a month. That's a long time to be with Jesus, when you really think about it.
Yeah. No, seriously.
Uh,
I mean, it really is. If you think about it, 40 days is a long time to be just anywhere with anybody.
yeah. So, but this is something that's been discussed, though. It's also been something that's been a part of academics, which is the idea that the Jesus that we worship, or I should say the Christ of faith that the church worships, is divorced from the Jesus of history, which is actually how the phrase goes. So a while back, there was a guy by the name of Albert Schweitzer who embarked on what he called the quest for the historical Jesus, because his hypothesis was that over the last 2,000 years or so, the church has sort of lost that connection between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history, to the point that the Jesus we worship now in the church is not who the Jesus of history actually was. So he set out to do as much historical analysis as he could, to learn about the culture, to analyze the scriptures based on that culture, to really dive into who this Jesus person was, and to match that up with what the church teaches about Jesus and see if those are compatible. Of course, the underlying assumption there is that there is no common connection throughout the last 2,000 years. It assumes that the Jesus of history, the Jesus that existed in first century Israel, first century Palestine, whatever term you want to use, just totally left. And then the church has been on its own for the last 2,000 years to try and figure out what all this means. Um, and of course, he actually declared the quest a failure. He couldn't reconcile. Well, it's not that he couldn't reconcile the two, it's that throughout history, so much information has been lost about that culture that he just thought it was impossible to even begin to figure out if the two are compatible. But again, it's sort of it's a false premise, because Jesus did not just leave us to our own devices. It's not like he ascended and said, "Good luck. I'll see you on the other side, hopefully." No, that's not the case at all. Because he did certainly left his teachings, which certainly adds to the value of Scripture, but it also adds to the value of tradition. The church has carried with it a lot of traditions, and most of those traditions are rooted in not just the person and work of Jesus Christ, but in the early church that wanted to preserve his teachings. And they did that through the use of tradition, which included the sacraments, which includes, honestly, some of the high church stuff, like the more liturgical style. A lot of the teachings of who Jesus is, who God is, are embedded in those. Unfortunately, a lot of churches who are more liturgical don't really talk about it. So it doesn't translate to, I would say, the lay level. Like, I've known a lot of people who have attended like Catholic churches and Orthodox churches. They have no idea why the services function the way they do. They don't know why the priests wear the robes of the different colors during the different times of year. That's just an issue of communicating what those actually stand for. But the churches do that as a way of communicating these things that have been passed on for the last 2,000 years. But it's not just through tradition, it's not just through scripture that Christ has continued to be active in the church, so that we don't lose sight of who he actually was, but also because of Pentecost, we have his spirit, which, Jordan, I don't know if you wanted to touch on this real quick, but feel free.
Yeah, so I think Ben's made a really good point about like this history. What I wanted to come in is I wanted to just talk about a little more of a like this practical faith living. So just based on what we've already talked about in the creed about who we know God is as God the Father and His control, and who we know who Jesus is, as the person of Jesus Christ. It's in a pretty clear theme, or at least a subtle theme, especially in our intelligent design, that God has a plan for the universe. There's a telos, there's a direction. So when Jesus is ascended into heaven, there's a plan and a purpose going on that God has enacted, right? That he's leaving us with these teachings. His work has been done, but shortly after that, at Pentecost, he's going to drop his spirit back in the world and fundamentally change the way we interact with each other. I don't know what the times. Ben, you may be better suited to this if you happen to know. Do you know what the time gap was between Jesus's ascension and Pentecost? Was there ever? I don't know if there's. I should know this, but I don't offhand.
Hmm.
Do you?
Was it another 40 days or was it 10 days? Because Penta,
I don't think it was very long.
that is 5. I don't remember. I should know this. I should know. I'm a pastor. Off the top of my head, I don't know. It wasn't very long though. You're right. It wasn't long.
Yeah, yeah. And so my point is simply this: that like, beyond the idea of us trying not to like divorce Jesus' historical figure from who he was as the savior of the world, because like his claims fundamentally make him who he is, right? And the Gospels as historical documents, I think, speak for themselves pretty clearly. Just to kind of that's really generally been my lack of contention with the quest for the historical Jesus. Although I did think that Ben spot on, it was a false premise from the beginning, so it was kind of like going nowhere, running on a
Mhm.
treadmill. You do a lot of
Yeah.
work, but you don't really go anywhere. Um, at least that's my take on it. It's probably pretty bad, but anyway, in terms of just like leaving us to our devices? The answer is no. Is that he's got a plan and a movement and all this, and shortly after he brings the spirit into the world. We'll talk about that in later podcasts, like what that means. But it's a really, really powerful thing, and it's a really powerful moment because then he indwells in the world in a new way, right? And like God's presence is there in a different way.
Mm.
And that's really all I wanted to communicate with that line, Ben. I thought everything else you said was so good. The only thing I could do is just tack on something totally separate.
Yeah. No, that's good too. That is a critical part, is to recognize that, it's not that Jesus just left us with a few teachings and a book. It's that he gave us his own spirit to help guide us and direct us. So, which is an incredibly powerful point. We could certainly spend a lot of time talking about that. Though we're going to talk about the spirit in
I think
a
we
separate podcast, which we have a guest for that. So, look forward to that one coming out, and
will.
listening to that, because we definitely
Feel like
explore a
we
lot there.
confidently say we will talk about it for an extended period of time.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot to say there. Yep. So that's a little bit on Christ ascending, but then also we talk about how he sits at the right hand of God, or God the Father Almighty. So, what image is that really? Like, did Jesus ascend into heaven? Okay, he gives his spirit. All right. So he's so active in the world in that sense. But sitting down at the right hand of God the Father Almighty, that's an interesting image. A lot of that image is bound in culture. Like, there is a certain context that is being referenced there. And Jordan, I don't know what your background was with hearing this, but for me, growing up, when I encountered the Apostles' Creed, where I would hear people talking about how Jesus is sitting at the right hand of the Father, to me that was a very strange image, because to me it just sounded like someone sitting down. And so in my mind, it was like, so Jesus went to heaven and he's just sitting there, like just chilling. Like, not really, there's nothing really going on. He's just, sitting back in his lazy boy, maybe reading a book, or I don't know, watching TV. I don't know. I don't know what he would do, but it sounds like
Watching season
really,
5 of Stranger Things. He's Jesus, so he's got season 5 already. But yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like, it just sounds like so boring. And I was like, and it also sounds very static. At least it did to my mind. I don't know what your experiences but that was how I understood it growing up.
Yeah, I don't think it's really clear that and I think part of this, Ben, at least in my opinion, and we kind of did this in the pre-show when we were kind of
Mhm.
prepping. Like for me, I don't think it's just really clearly articulated like what's going on. So I think before we address like what Jesus is doing on the right hand, and tell me if this is getting too far ahead, Ben. I think we need to fundamentally address what God the Father is doing in heaven,
Yeah.
because I think that's going to really kind of explain it. So, and I don't want to step on your toes here, so tell me if I'm going too far overboard. When we say sit at the right hand of God, it's an idea, it's a position of authority,
Mhm.
right? Maybe if you're looking for a modern equivalent, this is not biblical. This is just a modern equivalent. When you hear like stories or watch Game of Thrones, like the hand of the king, right? Or historically how we've understood the right hand, just those different kinds of things. The idea is that it's a person who's ruling with the king,
Mhm.
right? Like who's ruling with them, and they're doing it together because there's just too much work for one person to do. Now, obviously, God being God Almighty, that's not the case, but we also have to wrestle with the Trinitarian thought that Jesus and God are the same person and
Mhm.
one thing next to the other. So it gets a little complex. So let's not get into that because that becomes a literal vision word game, and that's
Mhm.
not how we need to understand this, in my opinion. I think
Right.
really what we want to understand is this: who God is active in what's the word I'm looking for? I just think active. I'll just use the word active. He is active in our world. Like I think churches don't articulate God very well, and it leads a lot of Christians to fall into, and this is totally off note,
Mhm.
into the deism debate versus the theism debate. Now, if you haven't heard these terms before, I want to kind of clarify. It's pretty easy. Theism, theism, is the understanding of God that is your traditional biblical Western Orthodox position. A
Yeah.
God who's got all the attributes that we've talked about in the previous podcast, but that's active in the world. Contrast that to deism, D-E instead of T-H-E. Deism is a God that exists and he's creator, but he's not active, right? There's a gap, and he doesn't do anything. So he's the kid with the magnifying glass. He's not burning ants. He's just watching us burn each other. He's just watching, and he's very passive, and there's no activity there. And I say that playfully. Fun fact: Sir Isaac Newton, famous thinker, was a deist, not a theist. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, a lot of people in that time frame were moving toward deism. It was a very common Enlightenment thought.
Yeah. Well, even like
We-
most of the founding fathers were deists. They
Deist,
weren't
yeah, pretty sure
Christian
Jefferson
theists. They
too.
were deists. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Jefferson even rewrote the Bible, which is problematic for us Christians in many ways. But whatever, we'll get into that. But the point is this: that like God Himself is actively ruling the world because we are theists as Christians. We are Christian theists, not Christian
Mm-hmm.
deists. You can't be a Christian and be a deist. There's too many hoops you have to jump through. It just
Yeah.
at some point it would just be unfeasible to do those theological backflips or gymnastics or whatever you want to call them. But the point is that since God is actively ruling, right, Jesus is part of that. Now, we know that because Jesus, right, the person of Christ and God the Father are one, right?
Mm-hmm.
One being three persons. So that he's actively ruling with God. Now, he's just doing this as a physical body. And that's where it gets a little complex. And maybe it's not healthy to get into that kind of like physical imagery and get specific there. But he is actively ruling. He's not waiting. Do you think that's a good articulation, Ben? Is that what you were trying to? I know that kind of went off the rails, but I'm just trying to make sure I'm touching our points here.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good articulation of that because obviously the image of a king sitting on his throne, right? You're in a throne room. I don't mean that in like the colloquial sense of a throne room where like that's, a bathroom. But the idea of it like a king on a throne, like that's not a place someone goes and just sits idly. Like that's where the king rules. Like, a comparison would be like the Oval Office, right? Like, yes, that is a place where a leader sits, like, in a seated position, but it's not an idle thing. Like that's where decisions are made. That's where plans are enacted. Like it is a very active position to be in, to be sitting on a throne. Like it's not just a position of authority, though that is true. We talked about that, but it's a very active position of authority. Um, and you see this all the time whenever it's portrayed, like in movies or in books. When people go into a throne room, they're going there for a purpose. Something is going to happen whenever people enter a throne room. So there's a lot going on there. So you're right. Jesus is not idle. He ascended to a position of leadership and authority. He's not just kicking back, waiting until he returns and actually does something. Like he is actively involved in what's going on. Like there is an authority taking place. There are things happening, which is certainly very important to remember. So yeah, it's a very powerful image that Jesus is seated at the right hand of God.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just illustrates like who Jesus is, what the whole point of his death and resurrection was. I mean,
Mhm.
to me, this is getting toward the end of it. This is almost the cherry on top of like validating Jesus as Christ, right? Jesus as Messiah.
Mhm.
Um, I just think there's really not a whole lot left you can say except for like it's kind of the crowning thing. Like this is who he is. This is the level with which he rules,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Which I guess does that transition into the last part of the line? I think pretty well.
Yeah, so that does transition into the last line pretty well. So the last line that we're going to go over is from there he will come to judge the quick and the dead, which I do like that version better than the living and the dead. Quick, I know is maybe an older use, but I should let you do that. Like I think you're more favored to that one than I am.
Yeah.
But
So Ben, I'll just admit it to you. When we taught Christian form together at all of that, I actually went in and edited PowerPoint so it said "quick in the dead." It's not a joke. I'm not kidding. I would actually edit my PowerPoint so it said "the quick in the dead," or I would at least mention. I have no real reason why it's more accurate. There's no good reason. I just think it's fun to say.
Yeah.
It just
Eh,
is a cool. It's something like Clint Eastwood movie. The Quick and the Dead.
yeah. It's I can respect that. Yeah.
There's
Uh,
no need to respect it. Just just gotta roll with it.
yeah. So there's some points we want to hit here. The first one is sort of the elephant in the room. So a particular theology, well, really a particular eschatology, a study of end times or end study of last things, that's come up really since the 60s and 70s, really gained a lot of popularity in the 90s, is
Yes.
rapture theology, where Jesus is going to come back and he's going to take his believers out of earth or out of creation, I guess, out of the universe as a whole, and take them all to heaven. Um, However, this line, uh, so let's just address that. That is the elephant in the room. So we're going to say a few things about that. First off,
Yes.
this line, from there he will come to judge the quick and the dead. Rapture theology is a very new idea, and whenever you
It
encounter a new idea in the church, you should always treat it as suspect because the concept of gradual revelation is very dangerous because we know Scripture teaches this, that everything we need to know about who God is perfectly revealed in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And the person and work of Jesus Christ are inerrantly revealed without error in the Scriptures. Right? That is ultimately the purpose of the Scriptures. So Jesus Christ is the full revelation of God. That is the final revelation. In fact, the book of Revelation is really a book declaring who Christ is and what he's about. So that's just an aside to say, I mean, I think we've already showed our hand on this. We do not support rapture theology. It's
at all.
problematic for a lot of different reasons. If you want to shut us off right now because of that, I mean, feel free. But um,
Don't worry
but
you on the
this,
way out. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Stay.
yeah,
Actually, stay. Stay and hear us out. Stay in dialogue with us. I think you might find it better than you think.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot that we could unpack with that. We're not going to get to. We're really not going to touch on much of it at all here, but there is an important point here, because when we talk about Christ returning, it's in one direction, and it's one way. It's a one-way ticket. It's not like a round trip. From there he will come to judge the living and the dead. So contrary to rapture theology, Jesus leaves heaven and comes here. Or really, as Revelation teaches, Jesus brings heaven to earth, the perfect joining of the two. Um, like Revelation, I think it's chapter 21 talks about, um, heaven comes down, the new Jerusalem comes down to earth. And that's sort of where you have these song lyrics, which Britt, I'll leave that to you.
Yeah. So Ben and I were doing prep, and I said, "Hey Ben, this is a great place for a David Crowder reference." And he goes, "A
Mhm.
David Crowder reference." I'm like, "Yeah, we can find out what kind of Christians our listeners are." And the real question is this: it's the imagery in that song that David Crowder made really popular, where he's like, where heaven meets earth, like the question is it unforeseen or a sloppy white kiss? Whatever camp you are on, I don't really have. Surprisingly, I don't have a strong side to
Mhm.
like fight on. I guess I pick sloppy wet because it makes me laugh a little more.
Yeah.
Um, but the idea I think is the imagery of like it comes down and it's connecting, like it's two things that are becoming intimate and synthesized, I suppose.
Mhm.
So I guess in maybe that sense, I prefer sloppy wet because unforeseen sounds like you just blindside kiss somebody. But I
Yeah.
guess if we don't know the day he's coming back, then I suppose it is a blindside kiss in that sense. So
Hmm.
the point is simply this, though, that the imagery that they're trying to do is heaven coming down and the earth becoming what it was supposed to be,
Yeah.
right? Like this is it returns to the garden state.
Mhm. Yeah. Which Yes, and there's certainly a lot we could touch on there. We can save some of that for later, certainly, because I know Britt, you and I could just go on forever about this because we've had a lot of conversations about it.
Mhm.
But you're right; like this really does emphasize the point that Jesus comes here, and there's also something else. So rapture theology emphasizes that in certain parables that Jesus talks about, he's talking about coming back and taking believers away. However, when you actually look at those parables, specifically in Matthew 24 and 25, when you really dig into it, it's the people who are taken away who are the wicked ones. The purpose of the story of Noah is to emphasize, and he says it in there. The purpose of the story of Noah is not to emphasize that the believers are taken away and the wicked people remain. The whole point of the story is you don't know when it's going to happen. It's going to be like in the time of Noah. People are eating and drinking. They don't know that destruction is about to come. They don't know that the storm's coming. That's what Jesus is saying. When he comes back, no one's going to know. He's not talking about a rapture of believers, such as how Noah and his family were redeemed through the storm. That's not what he's talking about there. Then you have the parable of the servants and the master, where the master leaves, the servants are left to see things, to make sure everything's managed well. He comes back, and what happens to the servants that performed wickedly? They're thrown out. They're the ones who leave. The good servants are the ones who remain. You also have the parable of the talents, where the master, he leaves, but he leaves, three servants. One he gives, what is it? One talent. Another one he gives five. Another he gives 10, or whatever it is. Um, Different gospels sort of have different numbers on that. And then he comes back. The wicked servant is the one who's thrown out, but the others remain. You do have the parable of the 10 virgins, but even there, so the parable of the 10 virgins, there's 10 virgins waiting. Some of them have enough oil in their lamps to last for a long time. Some of them don't. Then the bridegroom comes. He takes away the ones who had enough oil in their lamps, but the ones who didn't are sort of left behind. However, even in that story, Jesus references the point of the story is that you don't know when I'm going to come back. That's the point. The point of the story is not to say Jesus is going to come back, take his followers, and leave. The stories that explicitly talk about the followers and the master coming back and giving rewards and punishments are the stories where the good servants remain and the wicked servants are the ones that leave. So in talking about rapture theology, scripture does not really support that. Even in the parables that are often referenced for it don't really support it when you really dig into it. Because really, rapture theology supports not a second coming of Christ, but a third. Because it's like his first coming was the incarnation, right? Then he ascended. The second coming is sort of the rapture theology when the believers are taken out. But then there's like a third one where Jesus actually comes back and stays, which they're I'm not going to get into all the details because there's different interpretations on that. And I already feel like might have spent too much time going over that.
No, no, you're good.
All of this to say that to emphasize, and Britt's going to emphasize it from another direction. All that
Yeah.
to say, Christ is going to return. And even though we don't know when it's going to happen, we don't know exactly how it's going to happen. The scriptures do say you'll see him return the same way you saw him leave. But even then, the point is he is going to come back, and he's coming back to stay.
No, I think that's dead on, right? Like he's coming back and he's coming back to stay. So I think really this kind of leaves us with the question of what does this look like? Because we spent a lot of time, like Ben and I have done a lot of things. We've spent a lot of time deconstructing current views, understandings of what this line means and how it will play out, right? Like when he returns to start judgment, right? And so instead of you know getting sucked up out of your body into heaven and that is judgment, it's a little different. So you're like, okay, if you're following along with this, you're like, okay, I got you, like I get it, that's not what's happening, but can you paint me a picture, can you explain to me what's going on? So I want to use a reference that I think is really really innocent. I think it's really simple, and it's not because I think you as a listener are any less intelligent. I just think there's a lot more connotations and like baggage with trying to like get into Revelation and dig through that. And
Mm.
secondly, I'm not good enough of a Bible scholar to like actually do that. So this is both my fault and me trying to keep it simple without like going into unneeded context. So I want to reference somebody who we've referenced a million times before, but this is really, I think, what separates this person as a Christian author from a lot of other ones of his time and really makes him good. It's C.S. Lewis in particular. So I've talked a lot about the Chronicles of Narnia. I'm at the age of my life where when you go back and read kids' stories, you appreciate them in a different way because you start to see that the points they're trying to make. It's a little
Mm.
more obvious what they're trying to illustrate. So I recently reread them. I believe it was March this year. We're recording this in July. So it was about 3 or 4 months ago. And when you get to the last book, the last battle, Aslan returns, right? He's our Christ
Mm.
stand-in for those who haven't read the books, right? The lion returns, the Christ stand-in Aslan returns. And what happens is he returns in the middle of this pretty meaningful conflict of people, right? That's kind of sort of sorted itself out. And he takes them to the place it all started essentially. Like he comes back and he roars and the earth literally shakes and he fundamentally kind of reforms it and they all just kind of like go together to essentially where they would locate the Garden of Eden as a physical place in Narnia, right? Like in that place. And from there, him and his followers, they haven't left. They're the ones walking and they continue to walk. And the phrase they use is onward, or excuse me, inward and upward. Excuse me, inward and
Mm.
upward is the phrase they use. So that they keep getting deeper into the majesty and beauty of God's creation and use that to know who Aslan is and what he's wanting to do, right? And it's really really powerful stuff because they the way he describes the colors and the life and how the people interact with the world is amazing. But what happens is the people that were in Ben's analogy, right, as he kind of explained this, the ones who are quote unquote left behind, right? The ones that aren't walking with Aslan, they almost seem to fade, right? It's like because he's come back, these people who are here, they just can't partake in the beauty, and it's repulsive to them, like
Mm.
it hurts them, and they reject it, right? And they just kind of fade away. It's really weird because there's a false god figure in the last battle, and he ends up actually consuming them. And it's the idea that the things that you worship that aren't the appropriate things to worship end up consuming you in a different way. Um,
Mm.
and so he doesn't advocate for a traditional thing of hell. That's not to say that Lewis didn't believe in that. It's just that all he's painting a picture of is what new life will be like. So when Christ comes back and judgment happens and he separates the sheep from the goats, what's going to happen is this: if you followed him, you're going to experience this inward and upward life. You're gonna really get to see things like the color green is going to be the best version of green. You're going to experience it in a new way, right? Like
Mm.
imagine being able to see something and see the cell divide, right? Like imagine being able to interact with nature, like there's a lot of talking animals in the book, but the way they communicate is more articulate, and the way they connect with
Mm.
humans is more articulate. It's nature as it was intended to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful stuff. And for those who are on the other side of that, they can't experience it because they fundamentally reject it and they're left to their own devices. A better illustration, a more mature illustration, and I think a little more straightforward is C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce. Also a really good book. Ben and I have talked
Mm.
about that one quite a bit. Really like that book.
A really
Um,
good book.
yeah, very good book. Both of those paint a picture of heaven. They both paint a picture of heaven on earth upon Jesus' return. So I wanted to give you that image because I wanted to avoid like the biblical imagery that if you've grown up in a dispensational tradition might be associated with, like, the eagle is America or whatever, and such is this country, the bear is Russia or whatever, you know what I mean, like all
Yeah.
those things that we've heard over and over and over. Like I wanted to push past that nonsense. Not, I don't want to call it nonsense because I don't be disrespectful, but I wanted to push past all those biases and all those things that are in your head and that imagery and put
Mm.
something new in there and to say, okay,
Yeah.
now think about the return of Jesus in that sense. Like you get to experience life in that new way. And that's really what I wanted to illustrate. And I think that's kind of what the parables are trying to get at, right? In a different way. Like the ones who are here are the ones who are experiencing God and creation and life the way it was intended to be experienced, right? Like what
Mhm.
it was supposed to be. It's the completion of his vision. It is the outpouring of his love to the nth degree.
Mhm.
At least that's how I would understand it, or I'd like try to. That's how I try to describe it. And I'm going to fall short 1,000 times, but I'm looking forward to living an inward and upward life.
Yeah.
I'd say that.
Yeah, it's gonna be good. Yeah. So that is just a little snippet in what we believe about Christ returning. He is going to return. It is going to fundamentally change things. Absolutely, Scripture does talk a lot about that, and we could spend a lot of time going through that. But also, as the line says, "From there he will come to judge the living and the dead." And judgment does have a lot of negative connotations. When a
It
lot of
really
people think of judgment, it feels very negative, feels very oppressive, something to be feared. But I mean, let's really think about what judgment is,
yeah,
right? True, pure judgment and justice is setting everything right. And that's not something to be afraid of. I mean, maybe we might have fear if we recognize things are not right in our own lives, and certainly the spirit is at work convicting us of that. Uh, so we already sort of experience what judgment is. But right, when Christ comes and he judges, he's going to be making everything right. It's not exclusively a time of suffering, it's a time of righteousness being enacted perfectly without corruption, like Christ enacting judgment, which I mean, it seems far too common nowadays to hear about, a case goes to court and so many people recognize what justice is in that situation, and the judge just rules against it. Or, I mean, how many stories have we heard of, like corrupt politicians or corrupt attorneys and lawyers and judges just ignoring things, letting people continue to live in oppression or even oppressing them themselves? Like just all this corruption, really. But the beauty is, Jesus is not tainted by any of that. He is not someone who can be bought off. He is not someone who is going to ignore the evidence. He knows everything that's going on. He knows everything that is righteous. He knows everything that is evil. And that brings about two very encouraging and hopeful results. One is that no one, like in the end, no one gets away with evil. And I know one probably common example could be, with all the evil that Hitler did, and it's like he was able to escape the judgment of the Nuremberg trials because he committed suicide. Well, that's not going to be the case at the end. Christ is going to judge both the living and the dead. No one gets away with evil in the end. Everyone, evil is going to be judged in the end. So that's one positive thing, is no one gets away with evil. The other positive thing is, which goes hand in hand, is no one will suffer injustice in the end. Everything that has been done against you will be judged. Like everything will be will be judged. So the people who have suffered abuse or who have suffered neglect, who have been taken advantage of, and the people who have done those horrible things have gotten away with it, won't get away with it. Um, which again, because it goes hand in hand, no one gets away with evil, and everyone who has had evil done to them, like they will not suffer injustice in the end. They won't have to face a judge that's going to look the other way or who's going to pass them over. The sentence will be 100% righteous, which I wonder, that's even hard for me to imagine because I've gotten so used to seeing cases. You hear news stories, you see things happen, and there's just so much injustice in the world that you wonder, what does perfect, righteous justice actually look like? Um, it's mind
wait.
boggling, but that's what it's going to be.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and find out. See what it looks like
Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
Until then, we should just do our best to be as obedient as possible and try to enact it as far as we understand it in the most kind, godly way we can, I suppose. So I don't know what else to say about that except for that. Did I? Can I make a few comments on judgment though?
Yeah.
And
Go for it.
just because I think what you said was really awesome, and I want to piggyback if that's totally okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I grew up in the era of churches preaching against the quote unquote "don't judge me" mindset.
Hmm.
So as a kid, ironically, a lot of churches tend to avoid the term judgment. The churches I was in were very much about it,
Hmm.
right? But what wasn't illustrated to me, it was usually done as a critique of people who wanted to just live how they want. What I think is really good about this is what Ben said, is this is perfect justice enacted. And I can't say any better than, no one gets away with evil in the end. All injustices will be made right.